Hi, everybody. It's Stefan Molyneux, host of Conversations with Casey. This week we have Bud Conrad, chief economist at Casey Research. He is an author of the new book, Profiting from the World's Economic Crisis. Bud holds a Bachelor of Engineering degree from Yale and an MBA from Harvard. He has spoken both internationally and domestically at a wide variety of conferences. Thank you so much for taking the time this week.
Look forward to it, Stefan.
So you have reportedly, or at least what I've read in your books and articles, you've said that you feel that there could be a currency collapse or significant economic dislocation in your lifetime. And that's a pretty widespread for an investment community to hear. More recently, I think that you've revised that to be a little bit more imminent. I wonder if you could talk about the factors that have caused you to shorten your prediction for an economic dislocation.
Yes, Stefan. We're right in the middle with a whole lot of symptoms relating to the basic confidence that people have in their governments and in their ability to issue currencies of significant value over time. It should seem obvious that even the little kid that looked at the emperor who was stark naked and said, "The king ain't got no clothes," I think that's the theory of economics that should apply to what governments are issuing in the form of not only paper money, but what is now no longer even printed on paper, but electronic digits that are inserted into computers and is considered something of wealth. If you understand that very simple concept, then you become pretty clear that in the long term, all governments have a tremendous incentive to print up electronically money that's not worth the paper it's not printed on, to quote one of the more famous Gerald Celente opinions about this. And the point of that is that you need to protect yourself from the kinds of things that are going on. A little more detail, you've certainly seen the headlines about the current fiasco of a debt ceiling limit on exactly August 2nd will create a huge problem if we don't somehow change our budget forecast for the next few months. Of course, that's somewhat of a charade and a symptom of the underlying problems of huge government obligations well beyond the ability to be paid. And that's what leads to the destruction of currencies. We're seeing forerunners in Greece, Ireland, Italy, and Portugal, Spain, that we call the pigs, because they have gotten themselves into too much debt and are in a situation where default would be easier. We as a country are not that far behind in the amount of debt we have when you add in future obligations for retiring baby boomers, Social Security, Medicare, and so forth. And it's a crisis that's still going on.
And one of the things I think that's missed often in the analysis of the European situation is that these European countries are not an empire. They don't have 700 or more military bases overseas and a massive military industrial complex, as you've pointed out in your book. The U.S. spends more on its military than the rest of the world combined. That is a significant challenge in terms of reducing the size and power of government that the European governments face very little of relative to the U.S.
It's amazing to me that we look around the world and wonder why we are not competitive and ignore that particular problem. In some sense, our country has to support the military that is so large. Your number's right, 700 bases. I think if we had a fire sale and sold them off, we could have some short-term assets to spend and get farther down the road. But that's not on a plan. If you look carefully at long-term discussions for several hours, you will not find either the Republicans or the Democrats putting on the table the most important way they could fix the problem. We spend around $1.2 trillion on our military when you add in things that are not included in the military budget, such as veterans, homeland security, some interest on the debt, and black operations. That is very close to the size of our budget deficit. In other words, with the stroke of a pen, you could eliminate the military and balance the budget. Of course, no one even is discussing it. You do need probably to have as much military to be able to combat the second largest potential attacker, and that second largest is China, who spends somewhere around $100 billion, but in renminbi real terms, maybe that's $200 billion, but it's significantly less than what we're now spending. We're not going there. What we are doing is continuing social programs, guns and butter, that date back to Johnson's time in a way that assumes we will be able to somehow print up the money and get there. And I believe that the current crisis that we're now in is not over. The banks still have toxic waste on their books. The situation will recur when the economy slows down, and looks extremely dangerous when interest rates rise, as they must.
Well, and imagine, this is what I think about when I think about the costs of the military-industrial complex, and I actually put NASA in that category. Think of how great it would be for American expertise in engineering if the amount of scientific engineering and technical knowledge were released from the space program and from the military-industrial complex and set to work on actual capitalistic, consumer-based concerns. It would be a complete renaissance of American expertise. But again, so it's the opportunity costs of the giant sucking sound of these engineers being pulled into the maw of this useless and wasteful programs. The opportunity costs are enormous.
Well, that's probably true. The other side is that many good things did come from military investment. And so I'm not sure that it's complete loss by being spent. What's the loss is when we put boots on the ground in a country that doesn't want us there, when we drop predator bombs into Pakistan. I don't know how we get a war with in North Africa with Libya without a constitutionally approved congressional approval. But we are. And these things are both expensive and damaging, particularly to our image, never mind to the reality of what we're trying to achieve, which is another important issue that somewhere in this discussion I hope we get to, how important energy is to our future as humans.
Well, let's talk about that, because I think people don't understand the degree to which the population of the planet is entirely dependent, or almost entirely dependent, upon free, cheap, and abundant energy. I wonder if you could talk about the questions or concerns that people have around the growing skepticism or rejection of nuclear power and peak oil and all of the other things that you've identified, and their impact on the economy going forward.
It's crucially important for human beings to continue to have a supply of energy. It took the labor off the backs of animals and people at the turn of the last century. My father grew up on a farm. We now, instead of having 50% of the population in the U.S. farming, we have 3%. That's because we have tractors, pesticides, and a whole bunch of modern genetic engineering that has improved our ability to produce on the same amount of planet surface area a food for a population that multiplied from 1.6 billion to 6.5 billion. The problem is we're closer to the end of burning up 100 million years of fossil fuels laid down than we are to extending and finding new ways of producing that energy to create the economic growth. India and China would love to live like Mexico. If just China did, it would require the kind of usage that is more than what the United States now uses, and we don't have that ability to create that amount of additional energy from the resources we now know. You specifically mentioned Fukushima. That disaster has been underrated in the news. Not only will there be parts of Japan that won't be able to be used for agriculture and living around that plant, but it has revealed a weakness that's also true of our own nuclear electric power generation. Namely, where do you put this spent fuel? In the Fukushima area, they put it in water pools on top of the nuclear reactors, and they don't know what to do with it right now and can't get close enough to do much about it. We have the same problem here. And when you add in the cost of managing that and handling it, nuclear is very much non-competitive for electricity generation. And to carry the energy story a little further, the one thing that does look like a good opportunity for investors as well is that natural gas is becoming quite abundant. We have it in our country. It burns cleanly, and right now costs about a quarter as much to produce electricity using the natural gas at its current price from nuclear. And my view is, of course, that there's an investment opportunity, which is one of the keys what we try to get to at Casey Research when looking through the broad spectrum of the opportunities within the energy sector.
Right. And one of the things that I also feel concerned about is that because of the amount of state involvement in almost every aspect of energy policy, including, of course, policing or arming Middle Eastern dictatorships, there's not going to be, or there may not be, a soft landing in terms of price. I mean, normally in the free market, when something begins to run out, you have lots of signals many years ahead of time because price will slowly increase and so on. And so you have time to find alternatives, but it could be that these prices are kept artificially low and then jump very suddenly, which gives us far less time to adjust as an economy.
I can see that happening. But let's put a little perspective around the need for resources. I think important people have figured this out long ago, including my classmate, Dick Cheney, who had the original task force for energy. And when asked by the Supreme Court if he would divulge what they discussed, he refused, even after subpoena by Congress. It was probably a discussion of how can we maintain our lifestyle by commandeering access to energy. That's a surmise, not a fact. I can't prove it. But the point is that I think there are important people that recognize how serious energy is, and generally resources. And look what the Chinese have been doing. They go to countries in Africa, build cultural sharing buildings. They build roads. They make friends. They develop long-term contracts for access to South American soybeans, to African cobalt, and, of course, to oil. In Libya, before the activities got out of hand with NATO striking Gaddafi's forces, it was something like $20 billion of construction projects being done by China. That was done with 20,000 Chinese in Libya. We don't hear this in the news, and that's important to understand, because while many talk of the Middle East perhaps growing to a World War III, I see that the big powers like the United States and China are at economic war, more like a Cold War. I think you could say that the United States and the West won the previous Cold War with the communists and Russia as the superpower balancing. But I think we are losing the current economic Cold War with China in our methodology and our results. They understand the importance of it and have been waging this war more effectively to make friends and tie up resources than we have.
So with this economic war, do you mean that China is taking advantage of the growth opportunities in the Third World, in the Middle East, and in Africa much more so than American companies are?
Which would you rather have, boots on the ground and bombs, or friends building roads for you? My point is they're making friends and tying up the relationships because they see the importance of it. Chinese don't come in and say, you need to be Chinese communists, whereas we come in and say, we're spreading democracy as if they wanted it. We're going to tell Mr. Gaddafi how to run his country. I think that that's one of the reasons that we went in there was the competition with China, not just this concept of humanitarian aid for some people that turned out to have ties to Al-Qaeda. I think it's a sham on our part, and I think other people understand it that way. Admittedly, this is not a consensus opinion, and I'm sure there's controversy about this point of view, but how we're handling it does not look to me to be effective. And that's what my main point is here. The result of this will be, in the resource wars to come, over many kinds of resources, food being one of them, we're going to see prices for scarce resources go up, and we're going to see that prices in terms of dollars, that is, the amount of dollars you have to spend, will go much higher than most people understand or expect.
It's really tragic, the degree of unreality within any sort of empire system. The degree of fantasy and unreality within America, wherein the American politicians and the media can say to the American people, we're out there spreading democracy. In other words, we're trying to give other cultures and countries a system just like ours. That's believable to Americans, or even credible, is really a testament to the amount of propaganda that's going on. Because, of course, from outside America, they look at an incredibly armed government with a huge military that's making huge profits from selling weapons to highly questionable people overseas, that is tottering on the last legs of financial collapse, and then going around the world saying, we're going to give you a system just like ours. And people, I mean, from outside America, they're like, it's like some guy whose house is currently falling down and on fire and rat infested and termite infested saying, I'm going to get you a house just like this one. And people like running, screaming. But within the empire, it seems credible. Outside, it just seems lunatic.
Well said. And of course, I think you're being based outside the United States gives you a perspective that most people and commentators in the mainstream, certainly in this country, wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. You would be considered anti-patriotic or something to point out the obvious. that a country that has this strong a policy of arrogance in the face of the realities of what we are facing of our own problems is a major disconnect. And I think you're right. But from us as individuals looking to protect ourselves and our families, let's understand that we should not put trust in, I was going to say God in our country, but I really mean the Federal Reserve to not print up money. A lot of discussion just came out this morning about what their plans were for how they were going to remove the quantitative easings 1 and 2 and the stepwise process that they supposedly were getting ready to implement. I say watch out when they do that, because once they decide to remove the stimulus, interest rates may rise. The pressure that they have put to create a market of extremely low rates to protect the government, who is the world's largest debtor when it pays very low interest on its debt, will find themselves in a very difficult situation. And my point there is that the crisis we're now in is not over. You're going to see it come back, and I think with a vengeance. I think the resolutions of what happens around the inadequate proposals of both the Republicans and the Democrats for the current budget crisis are merely symptoms of the longer-term, much bigger problem of far too much debt to handle. And so you as an individual, me as a person observing this, try to figure out what the investment opportunities are. And in particular, you can see my bias in the long term towards things like energy, towards things like precious metals. Agriculture we haven't discussed enough, but they're very related and important for the basic human wealth. And add to that some fears about interest rates rising, and you have a grab bag of fairly good opportunities for investment and protecting yourself from what the government may do to the denominated currency in which you nominally try to keep track of your wealth.